3 days before Queen Aurelia Vayne was to be mated to a woman she had never loved, I stood on a footstool in the grand hall of Alaris, adjusting the ceremonial mantle across her shoulders. 9 symbols worked in silver thread, 4 months of my best work, and felt something in the room go wrong. The moonflower incense at the dais had eaten through my scent veil for the better part of an hour without my noticing. When Aurelia's scent finally reached me, cold bergamot rind, crushed bay leaves, frost sitting on stone before the sun touches it, my whole body answered before my mind caught up to ask why. Not fear, not the flinch my training had taught me to expect from unshielded contact with a strange alpha. Recognition, immediate and absurd, as though some part of me had been waiting 30 years to be introduced to exactly this. Aurelia went rigid. Her hand closed hard over mine on the mantle's edge. She did not touch me anywhere else. "Everyone but the designer, 5 steps back," she said, and her voice did not shake at all, which unsettled me far more than if it had. "Is your scent veil failing?" she asked quietly, once the hall had emptied around us. It was. I admitted it, mortified. "Put out the incense," she said, "to no one and everyone. All of it. It's interfering with an employee's medical protection." She had just discovered, mid-rehearsal, that she was catastrophically compatible with a stranger, and her first order had been to protect that stranger's scent veil. That told me something true about her, before I knew anything else. We finished the fitting. Our fingers brushed at the final clasp, and the recognition deepened into something with teeth in it. She stepped back from me the way you'd pull a hand off a stove. Then Lady Thalia Erwin entered in the pale gold of her ceremonial gown, and I watched Aurelia look from her intended mate to the altar built for their vows, and then, slowly, back at me. Something settled over her face that was not desire. It was grief, the particular grief of a woman realizing she has been lying to herself with great discipline for a very long time, and that the lie has just become impossible to finish. "Stop the musicians," she said. The hall went silent in the specific, terrible way that 1,000 people trying to seem as if they are not listening produce a silence louder than noise. Aurelia reached up, unclasped the mantle from her own shoulders, and folded it, with more care than the moment seemed to call for, into my arms. "Cancel the mating ceremony," she said. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. The word cancel broke the hall into chaos I had never seen firsthand, and hope never to see again. Grand Chancellor Odette Lysandra's calm face didn't so much fall as detonate, quietly, from the inside. Thalia stood frozen in her gold gown, with her attendants clutching at her sleeves. Someone dropped an entire tray of ceremonial rings. A minister I didn't recognize actually said the word treaty out loud, twice, as though repeating it might undo what had just happened. "Majesty," the Grand Chancellor said, in a voice pitched for the whole hall to hear, "you cannot possibly mean." "I mean it precisely," Aurelia said. "The ceremony is cancelled." The Chancellor's eyes found me then, and I understood, with the sick lurch of someone watching a door close on their own hand, that I was about to become the explanation for whatever this was. "Remove the designer," she said, already turning toward the guards at the door. "No." Aurelia's voice did not rise, but something in it made the guards stop where they stood. "She stays exactly where she is standing, and no one in this hall repeats her name outside it as though she caused this. I am not canceling this ceremony because of anything Mira Sorren did. I am canceling it because I will not stand at that altar in 3 days and swear a voluntary oath that is a lie. I want to be honest and say that I did not feel flattered, or chosen, or any of the things a story like this is supposed to make a woman feel in that moment. I felt like a woman standing in the wreckage of the most important commission of her career, holding a mantle worth more than her mother's entire workshop, watching several hundred extremely important people decide whether to be furious with the Queen or with me, and guessing, correctly, that most of them would choose me, because I was easier to reach. By nightfall, the broadsheets had already found language for what happened. The queen who would not lie. The seamstress who broke the crown. Later, once someone finally learned my actual profession, the scent witch, which I hated more than the other two combined, for how easily it made its way into conversation. I hated all of it with the specific, helpless fury of someone who cannot issue a correction to an entire kingdom. Sketches of my face, badly rendered, thank every god available, so that at least strangers on the street did not recognize me on sight, ran beside speculation that I had done something to Aurelia during the fitting, some scent trick, some omega trick, the word trick doing an enormous amount of work in every version of the story. Markets reacted before the sun set. Carowin's ambassador requested an emergency audience that ran past midnight. Grain futures dipped and recovered by morning, which somehow made the front page anyway, as though a kingdom's breakfast wheat had personally weighed in on my character. Protesters gathered at the palace gates by the second morning, though I could never tell, watching from an upstairs window, which side of the argument they were protesting for. Some carried signs demanding the ceremony be reinstated, others demanding an Omega commoner never again be allowed within scenting distance of the crown, and a smaller, stranger cluster simply stood in silence holding candles, as if a wedding had died rather than merely been cancelled. I tried to resign the morning after. I went to the palace steward's office with the mantle still in its case, my resignation written and rewritten 4 times the night before. Each draft a little less apologetic than the last, and none of them apologetic enough to satisfy the part of me that still felt, absurdly, as though I owed the entire kingdom a curtsy for existing near its queen. I was told, to my surprise, that the queen had already authorized it. No argument, no delay, effective immediately, no exit interview, no clause requiring my silence. It should have felt like relief. It felt like being let go of. Then, an hour before I was meant to leave the grounds for what I assumed would be the last time, a page found me in the half-dismantled Grand Hall and said the Queen requested 10 private minutes. We spoke among the wreckage of a ceremony that would never happen. White lilies already browning at the edges in their wire cages, silk banners half taken down and pooling on the floor like something fallen out of the sky. Aurelia did not sit. She stood with her hands behind her back, in the particular posture I would later learn she used when she was bracing herself for something. "I am not going to apologize for canceling," she said. "I would do it again in the same minute. But I owe you an apology for the part of it that landed on you, and I did not think carefully enough, in the moment, about what that would cost you." "Did you cancel because we're compatible?" I asked, because I needed to know, and because I have never been especially good at leaving a dangerous question unasked. "No," she said, and then, after a silence long enough that I understood she was deciding how much truth to hand a stranger, "Meeting you reminded me what wanting something felt like. I had forgotten. That was enough to make the lie I was about to tell impossible to finish. I did not melt. I want that understood clearly, because I think it matters to what came after. I told her that one honest sentence in an empty hall would not stop the nobles currently deciding, over breakfast, whether my mother's workshop deserved to survive the month. "I know," she said. "What do you want done?" "I want my name back," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, the way she looked at treaties, I would learn later, when she was deciding whether a document could actually hold the weight being asked of it. "Then let's see what I can build you instead of an apology," she said. The idea she proposed 3 days later, through a formally worded letter delivered by an aide rather than in person, which I noted, and appreciated, as evidence that she had heard what I'd said about not wanting to be managed, was this. The diplomatic summit between Alaris and Carowin could not simply be cancelled along with the mating. Ministers on both sides needed something to sign, some public ceremony that would let each kingdom's citizens believe their governments hadn't simply fallen down a well together. Aurelia wanted a new state ceremony, invented from nothing, that would bind the 2 kingdoms without binding either woman's body to it. No such right existed. She was asking me to build one in 3 weeks. She was also, unmistakably, asking me to stay near her. I told her as much, in the second letter I sent back, because I have never once in my professional life pretended not to notice the obvious. She wrote back with a bluntness I had not expected from a woman the broadsheets called the Iron Alpha. Yes, that possibility concerns me too. The contract she sent afterward was strange enough that I had my own lawyer review every clause twice, and then a second lawyer, my mother's, review it a third time out of pure disbelief. My employment would be administered through an independent civil office, not the Crown, meaning Aurelia could not personally dismiss me, promote me, or so much as adjust my fee without that office's sign-off. My working hours were mine to set. Any private meeting between us required my consent, given fresh each time, not assumed from the last, and logged by a clerk neither of us controlled. My designation would remain sealed in my file rather than announced. I would receive no royal privileges, no titles, no compensation beyond a designer's normal fee, and no housing inside the palace unless I asked for it myself, in writing. And this clause I read 3 times before I believed it. Aurelia was contractually barred from using any alpha command tone or pressure in my presence, enforceable by an outside arbiter if I ever reported a violation, with no royal appeal available to her. I told myself I accepted because the project itself was irresistible, an entire ceremonial form built from nothing, the kind of commission that comes once in a career if it comes at all. That was true. It was also not the whole truth, and I knew it even as I signed. I began the work the way I always begin work, by asking questions no one had thought to ask her before. What did the crown mean to her, apart from the weight of it? Which traditions she'd inherited did she actually hate? Which did she secretly love, and would never admit to loving? Because admitting to loving anything gave the nobles a lever to pull. What color put her back in her childhood? What her mother used to sing? What single symbol, if she had to choose only one, would stand in for choice rather than obligation? She was terrible at answering these questions at first, in the particular way of someone who has trained herself for 9 years not to want anything out loud. I told her, more than once, that a ceremony is a story told through space, through where people stand, what they wear, what they smell, what they're asked to promise, and that I could not build her a story about freedom if she wouldn't tell me what freedom felt like to her. It took her almost 2 weeks to answer the first question properly. She came to my workshop one evening, sat without being invited to, and said, without preamble, "Gray, the color." My mother's traveling cloak was gray, the ordinary kind, not ceremonial, and she wore it on the rare days we left the palace grounds together, so I associate it with the only version of my childhood that felt like it belonged to me instead of to the crown. I wrote it down without comment, though something in my chest had gone tight and warm at once, and it became, eventually, the lining of the mantle I would make her a year later, hidden where only she would ever know it was there. She came to my temporary workshop late one night without her crown, in a plain gray coat that made her look, for the first time since I'd met her, like an ordinary tired woman rather than a monarch. I had paint on my face and a length of embroidery thread caught in my sleeve, and did not notice her in the doorway for a full minute, which I think she found more restful than she expected. She picked up a needle without asking, and attempted, with the confidence of someone used to succeeding at things through will alone, to help me finish a border of running stitches along the edge of a new processional banner. She was catastrophic at it. The line wandered like a drunk man's signature. I laughed before I could stop myself, and clapped a hand over my own mouth, certain I'd just insulted a queen in her own palace. "Don't apologize," she said, watching my face rather than her ruined stitching. "I don't think anyone has laughed at me on purpose in about 6 years." Then, deliberately, while holding my eye, she made the next stitch even worse, just to hear me laugh again, and I understood I was in far more danger than a bad scent veil could account for. The procession gave us more trouble than either of us expected. Every version I sketched still had Aurelia walking down a corridor of standing witnesses, because that was the only shape a royal procession had ever taken in my professional lifetime, and every time I showed it to her, she went quiet in a way I'd learned to read as disagreement she wasn't yet ready to explain. It took 3 failed drafts and 1 entire evening of her pacing my workshop, treaty documents forgotten on the table, before she finally said it plainly. "I don't want to walk toward anyone," she said. I have spent 9 years walking toward obligations other people built for me. I would like, for one ceremony in my life, to walk toward something I chose. I asked her what that looked like, structurally, because I am incapable of leaving a good sentence unturned into a floor plan, and we spent the rest of the night reworking the entire route on the back of an old cartographer's map. An open square instead of a corridor. No fixed endpoint she was required to reach. Paths she and the Kerwin delegation could choose independently and meet in the middle rather than one woman walking the length of a hall toward a waiting altar. By the time we finished, my hands were black with charcoal, and Aurelia had ink on her cuff that no laundress would ever fully lift, and neither of us had noticed how late it had gotten until the candles guttered out around us. We spent an entire freezing afternoon in the underground archive, searching old ceremonial law for any precedent of a treaty sealed without a mating bond behind it. Surrounded by manuscripts so old, their illustrations had gone the soft brown of tea. Aurelia knew far more history than I expected from a woman who claimed to hate the subject. She read Old Illyrian faster than I could follow, and I discovered, turning a page she had already annotated in someone else's borrowed copy, that she left sarcastic notes in the margins of the historical accounts she found dishonest. Beside a florid passage praising Queen Aurelia the Silent, who had supposedly given up a great love for the good of the realm, Aurelia had written, in small, furious handwriting, "She did not give up anything. It was taken, and someone decided to call it a gift." We argued about Iseult in whispers that echoed anyway off the stone. I said history romanticizes women who suffer quietly because it is easier than admitting they were failed. Aurelia defended Iseult at first, with real heat, insisting that some sacrifices genuinely did hold kingdoms together, and it was cowardice to pretend otherwise, and then stopped mid-sentence, staring at her own handwriting in the margin, at the furious little note she'd left there years before either of us had reason to think it applied to her, and I watched her realize, in real time, that she had been defending herself. "You wrote that note a long time before you met me," I said, gently, because I didn't want it to sound like an accusation. "I wrote it the year I became queen," she said. "I have apparently been arguing with myself about this for 9 years and only just noticed." She took me, a week later, to a conservatory that had stood locked since her mother's death 9 years earlier. Behind glass gone cloudy with age grew a strange, deliberate garden, herbs and flowers that meant nothing to alpha sensibilities, chosen entirely for what an omega would find comforting, because the main palace gardens, Aurelia told me flatly, had been designed almost entirely around what pleased alpha guests. She had kept this one alive in secret for 9 years, visiting alone, telling no one, watering plants her mother had chosen before the crown had finished disappearing her. "She used to sing while she worked in here," Aurelia said, running a thumb along a leaf without picking it, "the way you touch something you've been told not to touch, so many times that the caution has become its own kind of ritual. Nothing anyone would recognize. Half of it she made up. I used to sit on that step and pretend to study while I listened, because if I called it studying, no one questioned why I was down here instead of at my lessons." "What happened to her?" I asked, though I thought I already knew some version of the answer. "Nothing happened to her. That's the part nobody wants to hear. No illness, no scandal, no single terrible day I can point to. She simply agreed to smaller and smaller things for so many years that eventually there was no larger version of her left to return to. By the time I understood what I was watching, it was already finished. She looked at me then, very directly, the way she looked at people when she wanted to be certain they understood she meant exactly what she'd said. I did not want to do that to anyone. I did not realize, until you, how easily I could have done it to myself instead. I understood then, standing among wild chamomile gone leggy toward the glass roof, that Aurelia's reforms for working omegas hadn't begun as policy. They had begun here, watching a woman she loved get smaller every year until there was almost nothing of her left to watch. For the citizens' half of the ceremony, because I had insisted the new rite could not belong only to nobles, I needed to see what ordinary people actually did at their own bindings, so we went into the city together, Aurelia in plain wool, with 2 guards trailing at a distance that fooled no one who looked twice. People recognized her anyway, in ones and twos, and I watched a complicated weather move across their faces every time. Affection, resentment, hope, the specific exhaustion of people who have been asked to love a stranger simply because she wears a crown. A child, maybe 6, ran up and pressed a paper crown into Aurelia's hands, folded crooked, and already coming apart at one corner. Aurelia wore it the rest of the afternoon, long past the point of necessity, and did not once seem to notice she was doing it. Later that week, I brought her to my mother's dye house, low-ceilinged and smelling of madder root and hot wax, because I needed her opinion on a blue that no palace dyer could match. My mother greeted the Queen of Alaris with the same brisk courtesy she gave any customer, which I found more mortifying than if she had curtsied, and then asked outright, hands still stained purple to the wrist, whether the Queen intended to ruin her daughter's life. "I am trying very hard not to," Aurelia said, without a flicker of offense. I wanted the floor to open. My mother, infuriatingly, looked pleased with the answer, and offered Aurelia tea, as though nothing unusual had been said at all. The replacement ceremony took place 3 weeks to the day after the cancellation, exactly as Aurelia had asked, and I have never in my career watched something I designed hold together under that much scrutiny, while feeling, privately, as though it might come apart in my hands at any moment. The Grand Hall wore none of the white and river blue silk from before. I'd used a deep gold instead, the color Aurelia had finally admitted, after weeks of deflection, reminded her of the conservatory's afternoon light. The open pathways we'd argued out on the cartographer's map replaced the old procession corridor entirely, Aurelia entering from the east, Caerwyn's delegation from the west, meeting at a central table rather than an altar, where the treaty itself, not a mating bond, waited to be signed. I watched from the artisans section, close enough to see Aurelia's hands, which did not shake, and Thalia's face, which gave away nothing at all until the exact moment both women set down their pens, when something that might have been relief passed between them, quick and private, gone before the cameras caught it. The crowd did not know quite what to make of a summit with no altar in it. Some clapped uncertainly. Somewhere behind me an elderly noblewoman informed her neighbor, in a carrying whisper, that she had never in 60 years witnessed a treaty signed without a single vow exchanged, and could not decide whether that was progress or a scandal, and had settled, for the moment, on both. Aurelia found me afterward in the receiving line, where protocol required her to greet exactly no one out of order, and broke that rule for the first time I ever saw her break anything, crossing the entire width of the hall to reach me before the Caerwyn ambassador, murmuring only, "You did this," before the crowd swallowed her again. I did not see her alone again for 3 days. I thought about that sentence for all 3 of them. The Omegaverse business of us complicated everything the way it complicates everything, though neither of us let it decide anything for us. I could feel how deeply my Omega instincts answered her. Not obedience, never obedience, but a pull toward her that I had to work, consciously, not to follow. I knew she felt the mirror of it. Royal physicians could have confirmed our compatibility scientifically within an hour. I refused the testing outright, and Aurelia, when I told her why, that I did not want a piece of paper deciding what I already knew in my own body, did not argue. "I don't need a physician to tell me I want you," she said, "and I would not let one tell you that you have to want me back." Her rut arrived that spring, on schedule, an event the palace normally handled by locking her into guarded apartments for a week and clearing her calendar of anything requiring judgment. She began the suppressive treatment early instead, without telling me, because she did not want the instinctive pull of an untreated rut anywhere near a woman who had not asked for it. The medication, I learned much later, left her nauseated and shaking and unable to sleep more than an hour at a stretch, and she went to council sessions anyway, pale and precise, because canceling them would have raised questions she wasn't ready to answer. I found out only because her aide, worried, let it slip that the Queen had been unwell for days. I was furious, not at the choice, but at being kept outside it. Again, decisions made about my safety without my presence in the room. "I'd rather be uncomfortable than make you feel unsafe," she said when I confronted her. "You keep deciding things alone that are supposed to be about both of us," I said, and watched that land somewhere real, We built, after that argument, an actual protocol between us instead of assumptions. I would decide when I wanted scent comfort from her, she could ask, and either of us could refuse without explanation and without consequence. We wrote it down, eventually, half as a joke and half because neither of us entirely trusted memory alone to hold under pressure. A short list pinned inside my workshop door, in her handwriting, because she'd insisted on writing it herself. It sounds clinical, written down. In practice, it felt like the first time anyone had ever asked my body's permission before making a decision about it. My own crisis came weeks later, after days of public harassment had worn me down further than I'd admitted to anyone. A stress-triggered heat, early and unexpected, the kind ceremonial designers are trained to recognize in themselves before it fully arrives. In the ache behind the eyes and the sudden intolerance for every scent in a room, including my own. It caught me at my work table, of all places, surrounded by half-finished banner sketches, my hands too unsteady to hold a pencil. I told Aurelia immediately, because by then, I trusted her enough to, and because hiding it from her would have cost more than admitting it. She called a physician, offered instantly to leave the room, already halfway to the door. "Stay," I said, surprising myself. She stayed across the room, giving me a distance I hadn't asked for, but understood. Later I asked for her coat, because it smelled like her, and that steadied something in my chest I hadn't known was shaking. Later still, I asked her to sit beside me. She waited for each request before moving an inch closer, and something about that restraint, that refusal to take an advantage my body was handing her without asking, undid me more than any declaration could have. We did not bond. We did not so much as kiss. A physician's tea and 2 days of rest steadied me, and Aurelia spent most of those hours reading aloud from the driest treaty documents in the archive, because the low, even sound of her voice, she'd guessed correctly, was the only thing keeping the edge off my nerves. Clauses about grain tariffs and border fishing rights, delivered with the same careful attention she might have given actual poetry, until at some point in the second night, I fell asleep to the sound of her listing provincial salt taxes and woke to find she'd kept reading anyway, quietly, in case I surfaced and needed the sound of her voice again. I teased her about it mercilessly once I recovered, informing her that she had officially become the only monarch in Ilarian history to put someone to sleep with tax law on purpose. She pretended to be offended and was not. Lady Thalia returned to the palace not long after, and I braced for the fury I assumed I deserved. Instead, she asked, with unnerving directness, to see the designs for the replacement ceremony, and stood over my work table for a long time before saying she was impressed. She was still angry, rightly so. Aurelia's cancellation had not humiliated her the way the broadsheets claimed, but it had embarrassed both kingdoms and left her own family's fortunes hostage to a treaty that now had no clear shape. But she told me something I hadn't expected, that a part of her had felt relief in the moment Aurelia stopped the music, greater than any offense. She had spent her whole life being praised as the ideal diplomatic omega, and had never once noticed how much she'd come to hate the word ideal, until someone finally set it down. "I am not going to pretend I am not furious," Thalia told me, that first afternoon, turning one of my sketches over in her hands. My family's trade concessions were built on the assumption that I would be queen consort of Ilaris by autumn. That assumption is gone, and I have to explain its absence to a great many people who do not care that it was never a love match to begin with. "I know," I said. "I don't know how to fix that part." "You're not meant to," she said. "That part is politics. This," she tapped the sketch, "is the part you can actually help with. Build me something Kerwin can sign without flinching, and I'll consider the rest my own problem to solve." We worked together after that. It was Thalia, in the end, who insisted that Kerwin should never again need one woman's mating bond posted as collateral for a treaty between nations, and who helped shape the diplomatic oath into something that would outlast whatever happened between Aurelia and me. She had a diplomat's eye for the places my designs still smuggled in old assumptions, a seating chart that ranked omega delegates below alpha ones, a vow that used the word yield where I hadn't noticed it costing anything, and she corrected each one without apology, the way you'd correct a tailor's measurement rather than a friend's feelings. What had begun as a scandal about one queen's broken engagement became, slowly, something larger. 3 women, 3 very different reasons, refusing to let old law use their bodies as signatures. There were near misses enough, in those months, that I began keeping a private, embarrassing count. Aurelia adjusting my cloak at a public event and stopping herself a hair's breadth from my throat. Me picking a stray thread from her hair during a rehearsal, and neither of us moving for 3 full seconds afterward. Our hands meeting over the same page of an old manuscript and staying there a beat too long. Aurelia standing behind me once during a rehearsal of the new processional, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her without any part of her actually touching me, and deliberately, visibly, leaving that last inch of space between us, rather than closing it, as though the distance itself were a kind of promise she was keeping to both of us. I noticed her watching me work, more than once, in the particular unguarded way people watch something they've stopped pretending not to want. Once, at a reception, a visiting alpha noble flirted with me at length about, of all things, my thread counts, standing close enough that his sleeve kept brushing mine, close enough that I watched Aurelia's scent sharpen across the room, even from 30 feet away, and watched her leave rather than intervene, disappearing through a side door until, I learned later, she'd walked 2 full laps of the eastern terrace to steady herself, while a very confused minister trailed after her, asking about tariffs. I found her out there afterward and asked why she'd left instead of doing something. Because jealousy is information, she said, not permission. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count since. The argument that finally broke something open between us came a few weeks before the summit, when the harassment against me had reached a pitch that worried even the palace guard. Aurelia told me, very carefully, that if I wanted to leave the project, leave her, she would support it without argument, without holding it against me, without making me explain. She was not firing me. She made a point of that. She was only, she said, trying to make sure I knew where the door was. I was furious. Everyone kept telling me what was best for me. The broadsheets, the nobles, now Aurelia, and I told her I knew perfectly well where every door in this palace was, thank you, and did not need to be handed a map to my own exit by a woman who apparently thought that was a kindness. Then tell me what you actually want, I said, instead of what you think I should be protected from. She struggled with the answer longer than I expected, from a woman who could dismantle a minister's career in 3 sentences. You, she finally said. Not the ceremony, not the treaty, not a royal mate for the history books. You, and wanting you, does not create an obligation on your part. I need you to understand that before either of us does anything else. I kissed her before she'd finished the sentence. It was not gentle, not at first. Months of near misses have a way of arriving all at once, and then it slowed into something closer to disbelief, her hand coming up to my jaw as though she needed to confirm I was real before she let herself want this any further. When we finally broke apart, I told her, because it was true and because I did not want either of us pretending otherwise, that one kiss changed nothing about the politics currently trying to destroy my mother's business. I know, she said. I kissed her again anyway. We were not private long. Someone photographed me leaving the Queen's Garden after dark within the week, and the story that followed made the earlier scandal look like a rumor about the weather. Traditionalist nobles said an ambitious Omega artisan had used scent to manipulate an alpha monarch out of her own wedding. A minister I had once fitted a groom's sash for stood up in open council and asked, without apparent irony, whether the crown intended to let a tradeswoman decide the kingdom's foreign policy from the queen's bed. Other Omegas, publicly and loudly, defended me, which somehow made everything worse by turning me into a symbol I hadn't asked to be. My face reprinted beside op-eds arguing for causes I hadn't chosen to represent. My mother's workshop windows were broken twice in 1 week. Commissions I'd spent a decade building dried up overnight, replaced by a flood of morbid curiosity from people who wanted gossip, not ceremonies, strangers requesting appointments just to see, as one particularly blunt letter put it, the woman who broke the crown in person. Aurelia offered royal guards for my family, and I accepted, because pride has limits. but I refused to move permanently into the palace, and she never once pushed. She condemned the harassment publicly. She would not, however, confirm or deny the relationship itself, choosing careful, bloodless palace language that technically committed to nothing, and I began, in my worst hours, to wonder whether she was simply ashamed of me, whether the woman who'd canceled a wedding for the sake of the truth had found a more comfortable lie to hide behind. I went home to the dye house one evening during the worst of it, half hoping my mother would tell me to walk away from all of it while there was still time. She didn't. She poured 2 cups of tea, set one in front of me, and said, "You didn't ask to fall for a queen, but you didn't run from it either, and I raised you to finish what you start, not what's easy." Then, gentler, "I also raised you to know the difference between staying because you love someone and staying because you're afraid of what people will say if you leave. Which is this?" I told her the truth, that it was the first kind, entirely, and she nodded once, satisfied, and changed the subject to a dye batch that had come out the wrong shade of green, as though we hadn't just settled the largest question of my life over 2 cups of tea. I told her so, badly, in the middle of an argument that had nothing to do with the actual thing bothering me, until it suddenly did. "I am terrified," she said, "that the moment I name you publicly, this kingdom will hand you a role before you've chosen one for yourself. I have watched that happen to a woman I loved. I would rather be called a coward than do it to you." I understood, then, that she had tried so hard not to claim me, that she'd nearly made me disappear instead, which was its own kind of erasure, however well-intentioned. We spent that whole night working out the difference, carefully, between privacy and secrecy and protection, and disappearing a person for their own good, and agreed, in the end, that the choice of when to be known belonged to me alone, and to no one else, including her. The answer, when it finally came, arrived through my own hands rather than any lawyer's. I had kept the original mating mantle in my workshop rather than returning it to storage, unable to let 4 months of my own work simply vanish into a vault, and one evening, examining the 8th symbol, officially consent, worked in silver thread over pale silk, I noticed the stitch direction beneath it didn't match the rest of the panel. My grandmother had taught me, decades earlier, over her own loom, that old royal textiles sometimes carried secondary instructions hidden in the direction of a stitch, a private language stitched into public cloth by women who weren't permitted to speak plainly any other way. I removed a section of the damaged backing that night, carefully, working by a single lamp because I did not trust myself to explain what I was doing if anyone found me at it, and found lettering worked into the panel beneath, tiny and deliberate, hidden under generations of later embroidery that had been stitched, I realized slowly, specifically to bury it. It led Aurelia, Thalia, the royal archivist, and me, down into records so old the ink had gone the color of rust, to a ritual called the Oath of the Open Crown. Centuries before, after another queen had been forced into a politically catastrophic bond, the crown had established an emergency right, allowing a monarch to refuse a compulsory mating alliance if she publicly relinquished certain hereditary privileges and accepted a renewed mandate from the provinces in their place. It separated romantic mating from political legitimacy entirely. The law had never been repealed. It had simply been allowed to vanish from ceremonial education, generation by generation, until almost no one alive remembered it existed. The Grand Chancellor remembered. She admitted it plainly, once confronted, without apology, without flinching. She had kept it buried deliberately, because she believed that letting monarchs escape traditional mating obligations would weaken a monarchy she had spent her whole life defending. Her philosophy, when she finally said it aloud, was almost simple. Ordinary people marry for happiness. Queens marry for history. The Chancellor asked to see me alone before any of it became public, which surprised me more than the discovery itself had. She received me in an office lined with portraits of monarchs I didn't recognize, and did not offer me a seat, though I don't think the omission was unkindness so much as habit. "You understand what you have found," she said. It was not a question. "I understand what it says," I said. "I'm still working out what it means." "It means," she said, "that every monarch since Iseult the Silent has been permitted a door out of a cage the rest of us have spent 3 centuries insisting was simply how the world worked. If that door is common knowledge, every future queen will ask why she should ever walk into the cage at all. And a monarchy that cannot ask its rulers for sacrifice is, in my experience, a monarchy that does not survive its first real crisis. Maybe, I said, or maybe it survives its first real crisis by not needing an unwilling woman to hold it together. She studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression was almost, briefly, respect. You argue like a diplomat, Miss Sorren, for a woman who sews for a living. I've spent my whole career listening to what people don't say out loud during their most important days, I told her. It turns out that's most of diplomacy anyway. She didn't answer that. But she didn't call the guards either, and I understood, walking out, that I had just met the version of Odette Lysandra that Aurelia had spent her whole life half loving and half fighting, and that neither of us had won anything in that room, exactly, so much as recognized each other. Invoking the oath would end the crisis. It would also cost Aurelia more than any speech could repair: unilateral authority over several trade laws, control of certain provincial appointments, part of the private crown estate, the ancient right to approve or forbid Omega noble marriages, privileges other monarchs had treated as sacred for 300 years. The chancellor clearly believed Aurelia would never agree to give up that much. Aurelia said yes almost before the archivist finished reading the text aloud. I asked her, once we were alone, whether she was surrendering 3 centuries of royal authority because of me. "This is larger than you," she said. "Meeting you made me understand something I should have understood years ago. A queen cannot claim to believe in consent and keep laws that let the crown interfere in everyone else's bonds. If I mean what I've said about you, I cannot go on meaning it only for myself." I loved her more in that moment than in any of the ones that had come before it, because for the first time she was choosing something out of principle rather than sacrifice, and I had learned, by then, how much that distinction mattered to her. Before the provincial assembly could gather to vote on the oath, I made a decision that still, looking back, feels like the hardest thing I did in that entire year. I left the palace, not because Aurelia pushed me away, not because some lie had come between us, not because I doubted, even slightly, that she loved me. I left because every debate raging through the broadsheets and the taverns and the provincial councils had narrowed, without my consent, into a single, ugly question. Should the queen surrender centuries of power for her Omega lover? The reforms deserved to live or die on their own merit, not as a referendum on whether I was worth the cost. I told her I was going home until the vote was finished. She was devastated. She did not hide it, which I respected more than if she had. She asked only whether I was ending things between us. "I don't know what we are outside this palace yet," I told her. "I think I need to find out." She did not argue. She did not order me to stay, offer me a title, dangle any comfort in front of me to make me reconsider. She asked only, "May I write to you?" I said yes. What followed was quieter than anything that had come before it. She wrote about council meetings that bored her nearly to tears. She wrote that a palace seamstress had criticized her embroidery, unaware whose student she was insulting. She sent me a sketch, badly drawn, of the crooked paper crown a child had once pushed into her hands. She asked after my mother's dye vats. One letter, near the middle of that stretch, read in its entirety. The council debated fishing rights for 3 hours today. I thought, at one point, that I would rather be stung by every wasp in the eastern provinces than sit through another word of it. I keep the paper crown on my desk. Odette pretends not to notice it. I miss the sound of you complaining about my stitches. I read that one so many times the fold wore thin along the crease. Some letters admitted, plainly, that she missed me, in language far less careful than anything she'd ever said aloud. I wrote back about ordinary things, too. A commission I'd taken for a merchant's modest wedding, the exact shade of blue my mother had finally matched. A joke about the fishing rights that made her write back within 2 days instead of her usual 4. Somewhere in those weeks, I understood that I did not miss being near a queen at all. I missed her, specifically, the woman who was terrible at embroidery, and wore paper crowns too long, and read treaty law aloud to calm a frightened Omega through the night. The Open Crown Assembly convened in the Court of Nine Arches. Under an open sky, representatives from every province gathered beneath banners that were, at my insistence, unfamiliar to the ceremony that had never happened. Open pathways, instead of the closed corridor a bride would once have processed down, no one walking behind the queen, because no one, in this new rite, was meant to be led anywhere. Thousands of citizens pressed against the square's edges. Aurelia entered alone. Thalia stood among Carwin's delegation. I watched from among the Artisans' Guild rather than at Aurelia's side, because that was where I had chosen to stand. The Grand Chancellor argued against the oath in front of the entire assembly, and I will say, in fairness to her, that she argued well. She warned that monarchies survive precisely because their rulers absorb burdens ordinary citizens should never be asked to carry, and she asked the crowd, plainly, whether one woman's personal happiness was worth weakening an institution that protected millions who would never know her name. A crown that bends to every ruler's private wishes, she said, is not a crown at all. It is a mood. Aurelia listened to all of it without interrupting, her hands folded in front of her, the way I'd watched her hold herself still in that first fitting, a year and a lifetime ago. I watched her find me in the crowd once, briefly, before she answered, not for permission, I understood, but the way you glance at a fixed point before stepping onto uncertain ground, to remember where solid footing was. When she finally answered, she did not give a speech about following her heart. She spoke about legitimacy instead, that a ruler who required another woman's unwilling body to secure her own throne did not possess stability worth the name, that a treaty resting on coerced mating had always been unstable, however solid it looked on paper, that a crown propped up by someone else's stolen freedom was weaker, not stronger, than it appeared from outside. I was raised to believe that a monarch's first duty is sacrifice, she told the assembly. I no longer believe that. I believe a monarch's first duty is honesty, and that sacrifice built on a lie protects no one, however beautiful it looks from the balcony. A murmur moved through the crowd at that. Not quite agreement, not quite dissent. The sound, I thought, of several thousand people reconsidering something at once. She invoked the oath there, in front of everyone, and relinquished the old privileges one by one, her voice steady through all of it, even when her hands, I noticed, were not. The provinces voted. It was not unanimous. I would not have believed it if it had been. 7 provinces against, 11 in favor. A margin narrow enough that the herald had to read the count twice before the square believed it. But it passed. Carwin agreed to renegotiate the alliance as an ordinary political treaty between governments rather than bodies. Thalia stepped forward to speak for her own delegation before the vote closed and said only, Carwin did not send me here to be collateral. We will sign as partners, or we will not sign at all. Which landed harder, I think, coming from the woman the whole affair had nearly cost the most. She signed as a diplomat afterward, in her own name, for her own kingdom, not as anyone's intended mate. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered, some stood in a silence I couldn't read, and I understood, watching it, that this was what real change actually looked like, imperfect, and contested rather than triumphant. Aurelia removed the Grand Chancellor from office within the week, not for treason, not for any crime the courts could touch, but because deliberately burying constitutional law from the woman she served had crossed a line that could not simply be forgiven with a demotion in title alone. Their final conversation, which Aurelia told me about afterward rather than let me witness, was painful, in a way that surprised neither of us. The Chancellor had loved Aurelia's father, with a stern, complicated loyalty, and had spent her whole career trying to protect the throne he'd died defending. She told Aurelia she had only ever been trying to preserve what he'd built. Institutions aren't preserved by refusing to let them change, Aurelia told her. You taught me that yourself, once, about something else entirely. Before the Chancellor left the palace for the last time, she gave Aurelia a small, unfinished embroidery hoop that had belonged to her mother. Half a pattern, abandoned mid-stitch, decades old. Aurelia understood, turning it over in her hands, that her mother had known about the open crown oath too, once, and had never found the courage or the opening to use it. It did not redeem the Chancellor exactly, but it made her something more than a villain, which felt, to me, like the more honest ending. We spent the months after learning whether we actually worked as two ordinary women rather than a queen and her crisis. I went back to my own apartment above the workshop. Aurelia began visiting, awkwardly at first, a woman used to enormous rooms discovering that my bed was several feet shorter than anything built for her. She nearly fell out of it the first night, and I laughed until I had to sit down. She attempted to make breakfast once and set the eggs on fire in a manner I still cannot fully explain, something involving too much butter and a fundamental misunderstanding of how quickly a pan actually heats. I sent her, mortified and delighted in equal measure, to the bakery 2 streets over, where she discovered exactly how difficult it is for a reigning monarch to buy a loaf of bread without an incident. She returned 40 minutes later than expected, faintly harassed, carrying 3 loaves instead of 1. "The baker recognized me," she said, setting them down with the particular dignity of someone determined not to complain, and insisted on giving me a discount I did not ask for and cannot legally accept, and then argued with me for 10 minutes about whether accepting it constituted a bribe, and then gave me 2 additional loaves as an apology for arguing with the Queen, which I am fairly sure is a worse offense than the original discount. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, already laughing. "I begin to understand why you find my palace so strange," she said, with real feeling, and I loved her so plainly in that moment that I had to turn back to my work table before she saw it on my face and made me say so out loud before I was ready. We worked in the same room in silence some evenings, which I came to love more than any of our grander scenes together. Her reading dispatches at one end of my work table, me stitching at the other, the quiet interrupted only by her occasionally reading a particularly absurd ministerial complaint aloud for my benefit. We argued, more than once, about whether her palace office desperately needed different curtains, an argument I am pleased to say I eventually won, along with a smaller, harder-fought argument about the color of the replacement. I introduced her to artisans who treated her, after the first startled week, like any other difficult customer with opinions about thread count, and she seemed to genuinely enjoy being disagreed with by people who had no particular reason to be careful with her. She carried bales of fabric for me despite 3 separate guards trying to stop her. On the grounds, she said, that carrying things was apparently the one royal privilege nobody had thought to take from her yet. She came to one of my professional exhibitions and stood quietly in the crowd rather than commandeering attention, refusing the chair someone tried to offer her at the front, and I watched her watch my work with an expression I recognized, by then, as pride. She let herself, slowly, admit when council sessions had exhausted her past, the point of pretending otherwise, coming through my door some evenings and simply sitting on the floor with her back against my work table rather than the chair, as though the floor of an ordinary room were the only place left in her life that asked nothing of her. When her next rut came, we planned for it together months in advance rather than around it in silence, and I made my own choices, each time, about where I stayed and what kind of comfort I wanted, and she asked before every step rather than assuming any of it. Eventually, on an ordinary evening with no ceremony attached to it at all, she asked whether I would ever consider a mating bond with her. She did not propose. She only asked the question and then waited, watching my face carefully enough that I could not hide my own answer even before I gave it. I went tense, and she noticed, and did not pretend not to. I told her the truth, finally, the fear I had been circling since the first fitting in that ruined Grand Hall. I loved her. I was not afraid of that anymore. What I was afraid of was becoming Queen Consort Mira, Royal Omega Mira, the woman who canceled the treaty, some new invented person who replaced Mira Sorren, ceremonial designer, in every sentence anyone ever wrote about me again. "If you bond with me," she said, "the crown does not get to own your work, your body, your name, your home, or your future. I will not let it." "You can't promise that," I said, "not against 300 years of tradition." "Then we change the tradition before I ask you again," she said, "and I will not ask a second time until it's true." She meant it. Over the months that followed, she worked with Omega legal advocates, with Thalia, with provincial representatives, and with me, reforming royal mating law from its foundations, guaranteeing any future royal partner the explicit right to keep an independent career, to hold private property, to refuse hereditary titles they didn't want, to decline any reproductive expectation placed on them, to keep a separate residence if they chose, to end a bond under clear legal protection if it ever became necessary, and to control their own medical and scent information without the Crown's involvement. She built these protections for every partner who might ever come after us too. Not only for me, because by then she had learned, the same way I had, that a freedom kept for only one person is not really freedom at all. It was not fast, and it was not always easy between us, either. There were council sessions where she came home frustrated past speech, and evenings where I told her plainly that a clause she'd accepted as a compromise still left too much discretion in the Crown's hands, and she went back the next morning and fought for the stronger version instead. Thalia argued Kerwin's precedent for partner autonomy into the record. My own lawyer, the one who'd read Aurelia's first contract 3 times in disbelief, ended up drafting half the final language. Only once the laws existed in writing, ratified and unrepealable, printed in the public register where no future chancellor could quietly bury them again, did she ask me a second time. Almost exactly a year after I first walked into the Grand Hall to fit a mating mantle for a queen and another woman, I returned to that same hall to be mated to her myself. It looked nothing like it had that first time. The great doors stood open rather than closed. There was no military procession, no diplomats waiting to collect a body as collateral, no symbols of blood obligation strung from the balconies. We had chosen, deliberately, a small public ceremony rather than a state spectacle, because Aurelia wanted the kingdom to watch its own tradition change shape in front of them. I did not design the whole thing myself. That mattered to me, in the end, more than I expected it to. I had spent my entire career managing other people's most important days, and Aurelia insisted, gently and then not so gently, that I deserved to simply live inside my own for once. My guild designed most of it. The flowers this time were not moon lilies but wild chamomile, cut from the conservatory Aurelia had finally opened to the public, and the processional followed the open, chosen paths we'd argued out on a cartographer's map a year before. I allowed myself only a single element to control completely: 2 ceremonial mantles, not one royal and one consort, but equal in weight and thread, each carrying a single unfinished line of embroidery worked in silver near the heart. During the ceremony, Aurelia and I completed each other's unfinished line, our hands working together over cloth for the last time as anything other than mates, the whole court quiet enough that I could hear the needle pass through silk. I cannot finish a life for someone. I could only add something true to hers, the way she had added something true to mine, one careful stitch at a time, for a year. Thalia attended, seated with the honored guests rather than any delegation, and told me afterward, with the particular dry affection she'd grown into around me, that she deserved some public credit for surviving the shortest royal engagement in the kingdom's modern history. My mother attended, in her good dress, dye still faintly visible under her nails no matter how she'd scrubbed. The former chancellor watched, I was told, from somewhere in the crowd, quietly, without announcing herself. I did not go looking for her. Some doors close without needing to be slammed. Aurelia asked me, plainly, in front of everyone, whether I chose her. No alpha command moved through the air between us. No instinct, no heat, no rut, no political necessity waited behind the question to answer it for me. I said yes, because it was true, and because I had spent a year learning the difference between being wanted and being owned, and had finally found a woman who understood it too. Some months later, I am still exactly what I was before any of this began. Mira Sorren, ceremonial designer, my mother's daughter, a woman with paint permanently under her fingernails. Aurelia is still queen, still buried some weeks in council sessions that leave her hollow-eyed by dinner, still occasionally infuriating in the particular way of a woman who has spent 40 years believing she alone must carry the heaviest part of every room she enters. We split our nights between the palace and my rooms above the workshop, depending on the week, depending on what either of us needs. She has learned, mostly, to say when she is tired, instead of simply enduring it in silence until I notice. I have learned, more slowly, to let her carry some things without turning it into evidence that she's disappearing again. We still argue, about curtains mostly, though the argument has widened lately to include an entire wing of palace furniture I have opinions about. We still apologize. We are still, after all of it, absurdly attracted to each other, in a way I did not expect to survive the first year, and has not shown the slightest sign of doing anything but deepening. Thalia has become one of Alaris's most valuable diplomatic voices, and jokes, whenever she visits, that Caerwyn owes its entire modern foreign policy to a wedding that never happened. The open crown reforms have already begun turning up in conversations in 2 neighboring kingdoms, which Aurelia pretends not to be proud of and absolutely is. Last week, a young noble couple wrote asking whether I would design their mating ceremony. I read the request twice before I understood why my hands had gone unsteady over it, and then I remembered, all at once, the exact weight of the mantle I'd folded into my own arms in a hall full of dying lilies, and the woman who had handed it to me, rather than let a lie finish itself. Aurelia found me still holding the letter when she came into the workshop that evening, crown left carelessly on a stack of my good silk the way she still does despite a year of scolding, gold leaf already catching in the weave. "You're going to ruin that fabric," I told her, reaching to move it. She caught my hand instead, and kissed me before I could finish the sentence, the crown still sitting where it had no business sitting, and I let it stay there a while longer than I should have. I understand now what I did not understand that first afternoon. Pins in my mouth. 4 months of my best work draped over a stranger's shoulders. I had not ruined anything by walking into that hall. I had simply arrived at the exact moment a queen finally became unwilling to give away a future she hadn't chosen. She had not turned to me because instinct demanded it. She had turned, first, toward her own freedom, and only once she was free to want anything at all had she chosen, deliberately, in full daylight, to want me. I think about the mantle sometimes, the first one, the one I folded into my own arms in a hall full of dying lilies. It still hangs in the palace archive, 9 symbols in silver thread, a ceremony that never happened, stitched into cloth that outlived its own purpose. I could have asked for it to be unmade. I never have. Some things are worth keeping precisely because of what they almost were, so that on the days I forget how far we've come, I can go and look at exactly how narrow the door was that we both, somehow, still managed to walk through.